One of the most common myths that you'll hear proliferated about working for the federal government is that the pay is just so low when compared to the private sector that if you do find yourself crossing over, you're just going to be making a huge sacrifice regardless of the circumstances. But I can tell you as a federal employee that this argument is at a minimum an incomplete one, if not an entirely false one. So in this video, I want to explain first how pay in the federal government works, followed by some reasons for why I think you shouldn't believe all those negative things you hear about it. So the way it works is you have what's called a pay scale, which is basically just a chart that shows you all the salaries you could possibly have from the lowest level to the highest level. Now there are different types of pay scales, but the most common one that most federal employees are on is referred to as the General Schedule Pay Scale, or GS Pay Scale. So on the left side of the chart, you'll see all of your grades starting all the way at the lowest, which is GS1, ranging all the way to the highest, which is GS15, and those are usually your supervisory positions. On the top of the chart, you'll see what are called steps, which are loosely interchangeable with time and service, although they're not exactly the same thing. And within these grades, regardless of which one you're at, whether it's GS1 or GS9, you progress as time goes on from one step to the next. As the steps increase, so does the salary, as well as the amount of time that you have to wait before you're eligible to be promoted to the next step. Now with this in mind, we can already start to see why this argument of low pay in the government is just a myth. Because for one, as you start to get into the higher grades, not even the highest one, which is GS15, but if you look at maybe GS12, there are some steps within that band that take your salary over that six-figure mark. Now, granted, that is taking into account the locality pay because the government pays a different amount based on where you live. But for most federal employees, you're going to be living in the general Washington, D.C., Maryland, or Virginia area, which is where I live. And I can say from experience that that is enough to live comfortably off of. Additionally, compensation comes in many different shapes and sizes. It's not just salary, but also things like vacation days or insurance, both of which the federal government has, obviously. But if you want to think purely monetarily, think about retirement. So the federal government has, unlike most places out there, a pension plan, where at the end of your career, after so many years of service, you're eligible to receive a certain amount from your paycheck for the rest of your life. And you can think of that as an addition to your paycheck that you're just getting later instead of right away. Additionally, for those who want to argue that in the private sector, well, they do 401k matching, where you get the money now and it accrues interest and all those things, guess what? The federal government does that too. So you have in the government what's called a TSP, or a traditional savings plan, which they will match up to 5% of the contributions that you make to that. And it's more or less the same thing as a 401k. So you don't have to sacrifice one for the other. In the federal government, you actually get both. Now you might also be thinking that the private sector at least affords you the ability to negotiate a higher salary when you're in the hiring process, whereas the federal government doesn't. But again, that's a myth. It's not true at all. You can also negotiate your salary when you're being hired by the federal government as well. And how do I know that? Because I did it. When I first was given my final offer of employment, it was at GS12 Step 1. But I came back since I was making more in the private sector at the time, and I negotiated for GS12 Step 6, which after providing my pay stubs to prove it, I was actually granted. And that gave me a huge jump start in my salary. Another reason not to believe the myth of low pay is because in the government, career progression is not just clearly defined and published, right? It's public information. You can look it up on the internet, and it's not shrouded in secrecy like it is in the private sector. Because in the private sector, they don't want you to know that somebody else could very well be making more money than you to do the same work as you. But also because in the government, that career progression is virtually guaranteed, where if you spend a certain amount of time in your pay grade, pretty much 1 year, then you're eligible to be promoted to the next grade. Also, you don't have to start at the lowest grade, which is GS1. I started as a GS12 because that's the position I applied to, literally skipping 11 grades. And some of these positions, including the one that I applied to, have what's called promotion potential. So my position that I applied to was a GS12/13, which meant that when I reached my time and grade of 1 year as a GS12, my leadership was sort of pre-approved in a sense to promote me to GS13 if they so chose. And that's exactly what happened. And lastly, even if you make abundantly more in the private sector, which is still possible, you have to remember that also comes at a price. That is, for one, your job is not secure, so you could get fired at any moment and lose that high salary of yours. And also, that 40-hour work week, which you do get in the federal government, is not going to be there anymore. So you might end up working 50, 60-hour weeks and potentially even making less if you factor in the amount of hours that you have to work to make the salary that you're making. But nonetheless, these are just a few of the many reasons for why you shouldn't be so quick to believe it if somebody says that you should stay away from the government because they don't pay that much. It's quite simply not true. But either way, hope you liked the video. Let me know if that helps, and I'll see you in the next one.